These are the oldest stories, online at oldeststories.net. And if you haven't seen them yet, we do now have some premium videos on Egyptian myth and culture over on Patreon and for YouTube channel members. I do appreciate everyone listening, but those interested in supporting me have some ways to do that now, links in the description. Now, as we pass the year 800 BCE, Assyria seems constrained. Part of the problem is that we have not yet found Adad-nirari's annal texts, which would give us more detailed and positive view of the era. But even without that, we can see that the king was unable to attack west or north, hesitant of the rising powers in those directions due to the lack of horsepower. Instead, he was bleeding the royal treasury, repeatedly campaigning deep into the Iranian mountains for horses as the situation on his southern border grew chaotic. At the same time, however, the empire as a whole isn't really doing that badly. It's probably one of the best times to live in the Iron Age Near East, either inside or outside of Assyria, as the minor wars that so plague the region have reduced as powers have consolidated and trade flows expanded. And Assyria itself is flourishing. Remember how previous kings have brought in countless thousands of foreigners into the heartland? Those migrant communities have all disappeared. They weren't eliminated, they were assimilated. The state made it difficult for them to hold on to their indigenous ways, and they rewarded membership in the wider Assyrian community to such an extent that within a century it'll be impossible to find any record of those earlier resettlements. Those who were settled as farmers or herders certainly don't have much, social mobility, but they do appear to have largely adopted Assyrian or Aramaic style names if they didn't have them before, and they are treated and taxed the way that the native peasantry is. They are well inside a mighty kingdom for protection, and they're placed along the irrigation courses of the mighty Tigris River in an era of favorable climate shifts. And so, while simply being a farmer was never an easy life, the combined peasantry, the native and assimilated folk, were all having about the best conditions they could hope for in this era. Within the heartland, then, the population was large and content. For the first time since the late Bronze Age, the number of people properly matched the amount of food being produced, without the famines of the Collapse era or the large areas of empty fields that we saw during the early period. This is probably why our records of mass deportation fade away in this century or so, though we do still hear of some happening just on general principles. The heartland being full and well developed is a good sign, but a seismic shift is happening under Adad-nirari as well, one that has little to do with the king himself, and one which will be responsible as much as anything else for the achievements of the late Assyrian period. Nergal-Erish, one of the great magnates, has been put in charge of what appears to be most of the Khabar River and Khabar Triangle region, seemingly being told by Adad-nirari to just take care of basically everything out west, as following the king's early campaigns against Arpad and Damascus that we looked at earlier. And while this seems like a recipe for the formation of a new breakaway kingdom, Nergal-Erish will apparently prove to be perfectly loyal. We will get to the fact that he was eventually disgraced, and while the level of his ultimate failure was likely significant, it seems that it was a failure on the magnate's part, never anything like disloyalty, just the sort of thing where you win some, you lose some, and he lost more than he really should have. But he hasn't failed yet, and he will see a good deal of success in the coming decades. And just as a little side note, there actually is breaking news on the Nergal-Erish front. Literally just a few days ago as I write this, archaeologists at University of Pennsylvania who've been working at the Ninurta Temple at Kalhu unearthed a new Kuduro stone there, apparently recording the specific year of Nergal-Erish being awarded the governorship of the Hindanu region, which was a previously uncertain date that fills in some of the gaps that I've been filling in this script with some educated speculation. Now, I wrote this during the Christmas season. I haven't been able to get a hold of anyone at UPenn for details yet. I don't think the schools are even open. I don't really know anymore. I'm old. Old people don't know when schools start. Only children know that. And so I don't think it, as far as I can tell, this article hasn't been published. It's just a press release so far. But it is a good reminder that archaeology is still moving forward. And for those of you wondering about a direction in life, there are still treasures waiting to be dug up. And the truth is, in 20 years or so, a lot of what's on this podcast is either going to be superseded by new information, or we're going to have a lot more detail. Someone else is going to make a even older stories podcast that goes into a lot more depth, hopefully 20 years from now, because archaeology, it really is an active, living field, studying a bunch of dead, inanimate history. Anyway, Nergal-Erish acts in many ways like a proxy king over the Khabar region. That's the point. He commissioned stela celebrating the achievements of Adad-nirari, and then also celebrating at the end the various titles of Nergal-Erish in full view of the gods and all literate peoples. He helps establish the boundaries of the Khabar provinces, including assimilating regions around the edges and pacifying vassal and neighbor kings. Depending on your exact model of population movement, he may have been involved in bringing deportees or migrant people into the Khabar region to work the land. But most importantly, he systematically invested in the land in a way that we haven't seen possibly since the Middle Bronze Age. While very few inscriptions survive, we can see archaeologically that someone around this time was doing all of this, was building all of this, and Nergal-Erish is our best candidate for building this massive system of canals and roadways all throughout the Khabar region, on a scale that southern Mesopotamia used to do constantly, but which has slowed in the wider Mesopotamian region in the last few centuries. And that's actually an interesting little tangent. The reason that canal building has slowed, I think, is that you may have noticed that the center of gravity of Mesopotamian civilization has been slowly drifting northwards. The lands of Sumer in the early years were unusually good for digging canals in, relatively easy soil and almost perfectly flat, and you had the sort of population densities and large governments that could really tackle this sort of project. Then the region of Akkad and now Babylonia, it's a bit less flat, and Ma'ashur is far rockier, and still it's even got more variability in terrain heights, making the cost of canal building greater, especially over long distances, and just reducing the opportunities available to make easy canals. These people, they're not going to dig through a huge mountain. You make canals where you can make them easily. And for all that, canals are still being built and maintained in Mesopotamia, and they're still very important for moving goods and for opening up agricultural lands, but they're being built at a much slower rate. Khabar, however, is much easier to run canals through. There's lots of tributaries to connect to and relatively gentle slopes. And finally, for perhaps the first time in history, you have the population densities and the unified, strong institution of the Assyrian governors who can both pay for the investments and then really reap the region-wide rewards to large-scale land improvements. And all throughout the Near East, not just in Assyria, we have evidence of capital improvements on various scales. We see olive presses being built in Israel. We see ships going back and forth, and of course sinking, leaving archaeological records. We don't see the ships going back and forth. We only see them when the underwater archaeologists can find them on the ocean floor. But we see these ships going from Phoenicia to destinations around the Mediterranean. We see Anatolia settling down into the great states of Lydia and Phrygia and a couple other smaller ones that aren't so great, but those two are really important for regional stability. And of course, the Urartians, we've already mentioned them building and growing their towns and expanding their territory. These construction and economic enterprises, we see them like in ones and twos in the archaeological record, and very occasionally they're mentioned in the surviving written record through receipts and logistical letters. We don't have stories or narratives from these, and if we did, no one construction would really be representative, so it's hard to fill as much of our attention with these as with the conquests of kings. But the truth is that each of these capital improvement projects was the fulfillment of someone's ambition, someone's desire to make their family better off and to master more of the world around them. I mean, nowadays, we might play Minecraft and build a farm and canals and roadways and productive structures in a week or two of spare time. But that same drive to build was living within the ancients, magnified by their genuine desire to better their lives. And once these projects, whether it be the work of a season or the work of hundreds of laborers for many years, once they're all integrated into the landscape, all we can see, to the extent that we see it at all, is often just a somewhat increased logistical capacity for the Assyrian army and increased construction capacity for the governors as a result of their many aggregate projects. So all we can really note is that this was a time when many such projects were undertaken, and particularly note that the Khabur region in particular is growing to become almost as productive in its own way as the capital region, a fact which will eventually have a large yet rarely noticed impact on the ability of Assyria to act in the Levant. But all that is big picture. While we can think of these governors as playing some sort of grand strategy video game in agonizingly slow real time, the truth seems to be that most of their time was spent in micromanaging quite petty details. We're fortunate to have 81 letters to and from a fellow named Mannu-ki-Mat-Assur, or Mannu-ki-Mat-Assur in some writings, a name meaning either who is like Ashur or who is like the Assyrian Empire, a fantastically patriotic name. He was, as far as we know, a governor only of the province of Guzana, covering the northwest corner of the Khabur region, and we're not sure exactly when he was there, only that it was at least partly during Adad-nirari's reign, and may have extended into some of his son's reign. But looking at his letters, we see the Assyrian bureaucracy in action. Or rather, we get a stark reminder of how personally powerful these governors were in the absence of all this extensive bureaucracy, because a lot of the time, he's just doing it himself. In one letter, for example, the king's messenger tells Mannu-ki-Assur to go town by town and have each town deliver 6 teams of horses by the 10th day of the coming month and have them available for the king. Now, this would have been a year in which the king was heading west, and this is how recruitment would have worked. The governor would dispatch someone to have various towns under him meet whatever obligations the king had set on him. In another letter, the Turtan is coming to collect 5 teams of horses each from 3 specific towns. And these are really small numbers for each little town. But in this way, an army of thousands would be collected from the tiny contributions of hundreds of mostly quite poor towns, in the way that millions of tiny raindrops can combine to cause a giant flood. And here again, we can remember that the people of the ancient world were very poor, and the wealth and strength of the great empires was only because there was quite a lot of these people, and the logistical systems underlying the distribution of each of their teeny tiny contributions was really far more efficient than any such a system had any right to be. Now, the letters to the governor are linked in the description. There's no, grand narrative in them, but we do have a lot of tiny glimpses of ancient life. One letter reads, "The king's word to Mannu-ki-Assur. I have sent Nergal-Erish to you on a secret mission. He shall enter." We have no idea what that secret mission could have been, but the heart really runs wild with possibilities here. In another letter, we hear the governor being ordered by the king to command a region-wide mourning and repentance before the god Adad. We don't know what had gone wrong exactly, but clearly some diviner had decided that some issue in the region was being caused by the people of Guzana coming to anger the god Adad. And so a great show of weeping and repentance was required of them, as were a variety of purification rituals and burnt offerings. In another letter, we hear that Mannu-ki-Assur was a commander over local military forces, something we don't otherwise get direct evidence of until after Tiglath-Pileser. But it confirms that, at least by now, the governors were commanders in their own right, and expected to coordinate with the king's army when the main army was operating in their region. In this case, he's being told to have his army at a certain town by a certain date to screen the main force, which shows also that these military operations were sophisticated, not just logistically but tactically as well. In the letters, we can see the governor being ordered around a lot, though of course we can expect that he was governor for quite some time and we only have a relative handful of letters. We don't see all the times that the king wasn't telling him to bring troops to a muster or come to this place or that, and we can assume that most days he was basically on his own, the only real sovereign for miles around. There's a point when he stops receiving letters from the king and starts receiving letters from the Turtan instead, which likely coincides with the rise of Shamshu-Ilu as the Turtan near the end of Adad-nirari's life. But most of what he's concerned with in these letters is the disposition of relatively small debts, the movement of small numbers of people, and the transportation of a few tens or hundreds of liters of oil and grain and honey and other sundries from this place to that place. The level of detail in which the governor was involved, we could read it to suggest that he was like a fiendish micromanager, but more likely it suggests that there simply wasn't significant levels of bureaucracy below him to handle these logistical details. It would have been him, a few scribes, a few servants and messengers, and of course a small permanent military guard who would have acted as his private thugs for most of the year, and as the professional corps of the military during times of conscription. But all that to manage what would be a fairly large kingdom, if it was separate from the Assyrian Empire. He's doing a lot of work. These guys aren't... The Greeks have this idea that the Oriental monarchs all just sat on their couches and relaxed all day while the people under them did all the work. And I don't know anything about the Persian Empire. Maybe the Greeks were right about the Persians. Who knows? But they're definitely not right about the Assyrians. The Assyrian Empire is powerful because the king works. the governors under the king work really hard. It's not exactly servant leadership, the sort to really inspire humility and awe and that sort of thing in people, but it is the sort of almost like the Silicon Valley entrepreneur spirit where the guy wakes up at 4 a.m. and he doesn't go to sleep until midnight, and he's working on his tech projects, building 4 different companies. That same kind of person in the Assyrian Empire was given that culture. They weren't really found, they all came from the noble families, but the ones in the noble families capable of that were educated that that's how you really want to live your life. You go, 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 you make things happen, you gotta be really productive. And we don't know how they did it. Something about elite education this gotta be the secret sauce in the Assyrian Empire. I'm just going off script here. I don't know that we have any particular information about elite education in the Assyrian Empire beyond the real basics. We don't know how they gave their people that sort of drive, that sort of competence, that sort of desire to do right. I don't know how they did it. I don't think anybody knows how they did it anymore, but it's one of these lessons for modern history that we really need to have that group of people to make things work really competently, at least to accomplish certain kinds of tasks like building tech companies and dismembering your enemies. But that's wholly off topic. Back to the point, Mannu-ki-Mat-Assur was a governor, but he wasn't a magnate, not in the usual sense of being governor of a huge area who was an authority unto himself in this period, not like Nergal-Erish and some others were. And we can't actually judge how successful he was, at least not directly from his letters, but one thing we can say is that he's on the western edge of the Mat-Assur. Most of his western neighbors would have been either subject states or tributary kings, the sort who were kept in line purely by their fear of Assyrian retribution, or from their reliance on the stabilizing force of the Assyrian presence. And during this period, the region around Guzana, and much of the West in general, was stable, something we must surely attribute to these border governors keeping things stable and strong in a general sense. Were the empire weakening, especially during this time when other states were strengthening, the narrative of this era would be one of the Near Eastern neighbors opportunistically grabbing pieces where they could, and by and large, it isn't. Assyria in this era is strong, stable, and a force to be reckoned with. Where we do see such collapse and opportunism, however, is in the lands of Babylonia. Adad-nirari's father had been humiliated by a briefly resurgent Babylon, and had taken his bloody vengeance by utterly shattering Babylonian power in the south. For the middle part of Adad-nirari's reign, stabilizing the southern border in the wake of this became paramount. Like his father, he seems to have claimed at least some degree of kingship over Sumer and Akkad, though he appears to have exercised very little direct control over the region. Instead, he seems to have kept the Chaldeans on his payroll as some sort of client, at least some of the Chaldean tribes, while focusing a lot of his effort on securing the crucial trade routes and mountain passes around the city of Dur in eastern Akkad. There were at least 2 campaigns in that direction in 795 and 794, and then some manner of significant religious event, with the great god going to Dur, whose significance is still debated, but certainly involves the Assyrian king being somehow involved in the religious politics of Akkad. And, of course, the religious politics of Akkad were, in turn, involved in Assyria as well. Though Shamshi-Adad appears to have hated being dominated by the Babylonian kings of his era, Babylonian culture was deeply respected in Assyria in a way that really no other culture ever was. This is something we've said before, and will say again, as the growth of the Babylonian cults in Assyria continues apace. An Assyrian king can't really be recognizing Marduk at a certain level within Assyria to the extent that maybe maybe they would like to. The god specifically of Babylonian specifically, and he is a direct rival to Ashur. But the cult of Nabu, who's Marduk's son and a god of writing and literature, is growing in direct proportion to the enduring power of the Babylonian cultural legacy. In the 780s, rather near the end of Adad-nirari's reign, he gets the precious materials together to build a huge Nabu temple in Nineveh. Despite the scale of the construction, we're told that the foundation is laid in 788, and then the temple is ready for divine entry already in 787. A quite quick turnaround for such a large project, suggesting that a large number of hands were dedicated to the task. For all that we think that Babylonian culture was hugely impactful on Assyria at this point, it's hard to really quantify it in a general sense. All we have are particular examples like this, all of which direct us towards thinking that Babylonian culture really is flourishing, even though Babylon itself kind of isn't. And all of this makes it a bit awkward, you'd think, that the last king of Assyria shattered Babylonian power and may have left the city itself without a functioning government for a period of some years. The situation in the south was a mixed bag of chaos and opportunity. The powerless were victim to whoever happened to move in, while those moving in had a golden opportunity to be the founders of the next great Babylonian dynasty. It's one of the few points in history that have the feel of the start of a video game, where numerous factions all have decent odds of winning the race from the nomadic periphery into the ruined but very repairable center. I mean, no sense playing coy here, the Chaldeans end up winning this particular struggle, though it does take them more than a century to get there. And we can't go into too much detail because we don't really know all the players, but we can broadly suggest that in the south are the Chaldeans, who are now firmly ensconced in the swamps of Sealand and projecting power into Old Sumer. In the northeast is the city of Dur, and we don't really know what they're up to, but they're clearly up to something expansionist. In the north, between Babylonia and Assyria, are a group of Arabs called the Itu'eans, who seem to have arrived about the same time as the Chaldeans, but their exact origin is extremely hazy. And in the northwest, though really kind of all over, are various groups of Aramaeans forming alliances and starting wars. We get very little sense that the once mighty cities of Sumer and Akkad are players in this game at all. Rather, it seems like the flat countrysides were the main goal, and the cities are prestige objects to confirm the victory in the region. Meanwhile, about halfway through his reign, something happened in Dur. We don't really know what, but Adad-nirari spent 2 years attacking it without apparent success, knocking Dur out as a regional player for a while. They could have been blocking the trade routes between Elam and Mesopotamia, or they could have been expanding into places that Adad-nirari didn't want them to. The trade routes into Iran would have been increasingly important, as Urartu's continued expansion up north meant that there were fewer northern routes open for the Assyrians to get into Iran, making them increasingly dependent on the southern routes. And in the 2 years after these Dur campaigns, there were 2 campaigns directly into the territory of the Medes, probably using mountain passes that had been threatened by Dur. But with Dur pacified, and with increasingly friendly relations with the Chaldeans, who seemed to have been content to offer sort of nominal submission and tribute to the distant Assyrians, Assyria was able to warm to their southern neighbor again. This would have been the time when the great Nabu temple was built. This is the time when the great god was sent back to Dur. This is also a time when it seems that captive southerners, maybe slaves or POWs or deportees, were brought back to at least the upper reaches of Babylonia and resettled as Babylonian citizens once again, under the nominal rule of the southern Babylonian cities, but with the understanding that those cities kind of sort of owed allegiance to Assyria, but nothing like. There doesn't seem to have been direct Assyrian control over the Southlands. Adad-nirari put out some sort of diplomatic effort or decree that set the Assyria-Babylonia boundary line, reconfirming that the two nations were indeed separate and friendly, though it isn't clear who his counterpart in these negotiations were. And with that, after about 2 or 3 decades of chaos, things in Babylon were able to settle down again. And the last thing of note, late in Adad-nirari's reign, is a series of interactions with a group of Arabs called the Itu'eans. Now, like I said, it's not clear when exactly they entered the region, nor where exactly the bounds of the region of Itua are, but it was somewhere on the Assyria-Babylon border, and since the border was reset, it seems that Itua is now wholly within Assyrian lands. Many Itu'eans appear to have entered into Assyrian territory peacefully and offered willing submission and integration into the Assyrian system, which even at a very early date has included sending men to the army, though currently only a few here and there. Later on, they're going to become a major foreign contingent of the army, seemingly paying all or most of their taxes in conscripts sometimes, and winning accolades on the battlefield as a result. These Itu'eans, by the way, are probably the source of the Greek confusion back in our Semiramis episode. The Greeks apparently came to believe that all the Assyrian military victories were won on the backs of these Itu'eans, which wasn't actually true, but they will become increasingly important over time, and some of that may have had its foundation laid here, with Adad-nirari's unclear diplomatic dealings with this growing ethnic group in his territory. But of course, like all nomadic peoples, the Itu'eans were not a monolith. They were a warlike people, as they say, and Adad-nirari was forced to fight at least some of the tribes on 3 separate occasions, including the last year of his life. Adad-nirari died in 782 of unknown causes, and he died fairly young, potentially no older than 40, and so a death by intrigue or a death in battle is not out of the question. But then again, neither is death from plague or other natural causes. He would be succeeded by his son, Shalmaneser IV, and things are going to genuinely start going downhill for the royal dynasty in the next 4 decades following this. But we're going to save that story for later. It's been a lot of conquest and kingship lately, and quite a lot of Assyria just in general, and we're finally at the point where we have an opportunity to look at some other stuff. Suhu, Phrygia, and Urartu are all on the rise in these decades, and each deserves a break to look at their stories. But before we get to that, we have a real treat. We're finally able to get back to our oldest story's roots again, because I have, from now until the end of the Assyrian Empire, enough surviving documents from or about normal, everyday ancient people that we can spend the whole of next episode just reading from the mailbag and talking about what we find. So join us next week as we read a bunch of letters written during the reign of Adad-nirari to learn more about what the normal people were doing through all of this. Thank you for listening.